Okay, so thanks for coming to our meeting this evening. We are going to be reporting about the status of the Naugatuck Valley Regional Hazard Mitigation Plan document, which will include reviewing some of the materials that we have already covered in earlier meetings and workshops, but also presenting some new information, particularly about new actions that have been included in the plan and identified over the course of the planning process. Our talk tonight will go through these overarching topics. We'll kind of review the basics of the hazard mitigation plan to make sure that we're all caught up and on the same page. That'll include a little overview of what the actual NVCOG hazard mitigation plan document looks like, what it contains. We'll review a bit of the public feedback that we've received over the course of the planning process so far, and there is still opportunity for public feedback, so we encourage that. And then we'll talk in more detail about some of the mitigation actions that are included in the document. And after that, we'll go through the next steps to adopt the plan and finalize that. So we'll start off, I'll hand things off to Dave Murphy, and he'll tell us about hazard mitigation plans.
Sounds good. All right, Noah, I think you can just go to the next slide for me. All right, so hazard mitigation planning. This is something that has been going on now for 20 years. I can't believe it, since the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000. That time has gone quickly. And these two things that are here on this slide, what is a natural hazard and what is hazard mitigation, have not changed in that 20 years. So we're still talking about extreme natural events that pose a risk to people, infrastructure, and resources. These are natural events that pose a risk, but also take some sort of toll. Usually there's a loss that occurs to property, and infrequently here in Connecticut, loss of life, but sometimes that occurs as well. So hazard mitigation are the actions that we can take right now or next year or in 6 months to reduce or eliminate those long-term risks to people. And again, reduce those losses that are occurring. So we don't want to have to pay to repair a road every time it washes out. We'd rather do something to prevent that from happening going forward. So the program, as explained by FEMA, is really a loss reduction program, natural hazard mitigation. It's about reducing those losses. We have a couple pictures here from Bristol, the Quadrook River flooding, and then at the bottom right-hand corner is the flood protection system in Ansonia and Derby. So in some places we have taken steps to reduce the losses by building expensive structural projects, but that largely does not occur anymore because of the expenses that are required. So we look for other ways to mitigate those losses, and we'll talk about some of those today. Next slide. So the planning process really has always consisted of these 4 components, and they are closely connected to one another. So like I said, the program hazard mitigation is to reduce the losses of life, damage, and costs to all of us. An important part of that is education of residents, policymakers, responders, town officials, the public in general. Everyone needs to kind of be on the same page and understand what hazard mitigation is about and how to be prepared to reduce losses. The hazard mitigation planning must always be connected to other community planning efforts, like here in Connecticut, towns develop plans of conservation and development, POCDs. We want to make sure that we're aligned with the POCDs as well as with emergency operations plans and other plans that the towns produce. And then enhancing natural resources and community capabilities are other important parts of hazard mitigation planning. And these four components really, feed on one another, and they are kind of cyclical. And we want to make sure that we are constantly doing this, not only when we update the plan every 5 years, but as we're checking in with it from year to year. Next slide. So here is a list of the hazards that are included in the NVCOG plan. And importantly, these hazards were included in all the individual plans that came before this multi-jurisdiction regional plan. So City of Waterbury had its own plan, Town of Southbury had its own plan, Bristol was part of the former Central Connecticut Region plan, We wanted to make sure that we were covering all the same hazards that are in those plans. So they are floods, hurricanes, tropical storms, summer storms, tornadoes and high wind events, severe winter storms, dam failure. Drought is something that we've been including more and more in these plans. Wildfires, landslides. Landslides, it's funny because the Naugatuck Valley region was the first planning process in Connecticut that we went through where we found it was important to include landslides. And if you think about the cities and how they've developed, a lot of steep slopes are present. And so landslides have actually occurred in Waterbury and in Ansonia, Derby, and Shelton. And then lastly, earthquakes. And we are required by FEMA and by the state to include climate change where it is necessary to include it. So typically all of the hazards except earthquakes have some component that's influenced by a changing climate. Next slide. Here are some of the ways that climate change can impact those hazards. So riverine floods and erosion risks can increase because we're having more intense precipitation, more intense and kind of more cyclical. We're getting caught in these trains of moisture that are hitting the region, and we're trying to figure out, and hopefully we'll someday understand how that's related to changing climate. But we also do understand that more atmospheric heat energy can lead to more intense hurricanes, tornadoes, and other wind events. There's a lot of studies going on about whether or not hurricanes will be more frequent. And right now, scientists believe that that is not the case, but that they will still occur and they will be more intense and they will last longer over land because they have more heat energy to drive them. Snow, so we might have a shorter snow season with increasing temperatures, but the snow will be wetter and heavier, and that can lead to damage to buildings. Dam failure is something that we don't think will increase in the short term, but over the long term with more severe precipitation, we need to be mindful of those risks. Flashy droughts will become more frequent. We're already seeing evidence of that here in Connecticut. Wildfires may become more severe if we have extended drier periods and higher temperatures. And then relative to landslides, more intense precipitation could lead to more landslide risk. We typically talk about 6 hazard mitigation strategies or action types, and that is something that's been in place now with all the plans that came before this one. So Waterbury's plan, Bristol's plan, Southbury's plan, the VCOG plan for Ansonia, Derby, Shelton, and Seymour. All of them had this in common. So it wasn't too hard to bring them all together for this multi-jurisdiction plan. I'll just quickly go through the 6 categories here on the slide. Natural resource protection is typically flood-related, setting aside land or restoring floodplains, but it also can be applied to wildfire risk. So setting aside natural lands rather than building in them and then later on being at risk for wildfires. Prevention means it's not preventing the incident from occurring. We can't prevent a hurricane, but it's preventing the damage. So building codes is kind of the classic example for prevention. It could be snow load building codes, it could be wind damage building codes, or it could be floodproofing. Floodproofing also falls into property protection, which is the green bubble there. So wet and dry floodproofing, storm shutters, those are all methods of property protection. Structural projects, those are the ones that kind of are the most fun. And by fun, I mean the most expensive. So removing dams or enlarging channels, replacing bridges and culverts, those are structural projects. And then emergency services. Remember, mitigation is about reducing losses. So where does that dovetail with emergency services? Well, we want to make sure that we can get to a shelter. People can get to a shelter before a disaster. We want to make sure that we have sandbags that we can deploy to reduce losses temporarily during the flood. Those are different kinds of emergency services. And then public education really encompasses everything. And we alluded to this a few minutes ago. So making sure people understand the risks, where to build, where to develop, where to move, how to protect themselves and their property. That is public education. Next slide. There we go. This is kind of a glimpse of the draft plan that we have in place that can be reviewed. So the plan is set up to kind of be readable in this following manner. So we have a multi-jurisdiction section, which is the so-called regional section. And that's the cover page on the left-hand side of this is the cover of the regional plan. So it profiles the hazards, describes what a tornado is, rather than describing what a tornado is in the section for every town. We do that once in the beginning, and all the different towns share this multi-jurisdiction part of the document. Then each town has its own annex or chapter. The picture right there is the cover of the annex for Bethlehem. And then this is the place where we can be more specific about the risks that can occur in each municipality and the actions that can be undertaken. The third set of graphics here on the slide is something that we call the fact sheets. And this is something that I came up with a few years ago to make these plans more readable, because after 20 years of doing this, it's starting to become sort of dreadful for members of the public to read these plans. We wanted something in these plans that was flashy and that could be ripped out of the plan and people could remember, they could put on their refrigerator, and it would just be kind of more interesting for folks to read these plans. So the fact sheets were born, and we have a set of fact sheets about mitigation success stories. We kind of had to have a set of fact sheets about public outreach efforts that were undertaken. And we have a set of fact sheets about regional challenges that are common to the NVCOG region. And so that these are, again, they'll be in the plan document, and kind of give people a little break when they're reading a wall of text. You can come to a page that has some graphics and kind of take your time and digest some of the issues that are common to the region. And then the graphic on the right-hand side of the slide is a list of all the mitigation actions. It's a snapshot of the list, and it shows how they're kind of organized and what the categories are for each action, kind of which department would be undertaking action, what the cost could be, et cetera. Those are in the columns. So these are all different ways to kind of express the risks and mitigation strategies in the plan. I think I'm turning over to you now, Noah, right?
Yes. Thanks, Dave. So on the topic of those mitigation actions, we're going to kind of build up to that and present a little bit about that after I first go through the public comments. The goal here being to really highlight the fact that these comments come from, these actions come from public comments as well as some other sources, which I'll touch on. So first of all, there's been a series of public input opportunities, an online public survey, a series of virtual public workshops and virtual public meetings, such as this one. And there have also been some community meetings and a story map, online story map through the NVCOG website that people can interact with, and that gives kind of a geographical way to think about hazard mitigation and for members of the public to see and give input into hazard mitigation. And we've collected input through these different tools, heard what members of the public have to say, and I'm going to try to summarize some of that specifically with regard to the actions that we are identifying. So some of the top priorities that we've been seeing: resilient power grid is important, making sure that the electricity stays on through a storm or is quickly restored following a storm. More broadly, upgrading infrastructure, including roads and bridges, identifying risk areas, making sure that communities understand where different hazards are coming from, what areas are most at risk. There's been feedback about assisting vulnerable residents, residents who may have mobility challenges and therefore not be able to evacuate following a storm, residents who have particular health challenges and might need a rapid response following a storm, or are particularly vulnerable to power outages because of their health conditions. Coordination with state and local response. So, we have the local emergency response teams as well as the state teams, and making sure that there's coordination between the two so that everyone is responding efficiently and effectively. And then education and outreach. So these kind of relatively broad categories are some of the top priorities that we've seen. One of the things that we can do is look at kind of the open-ended feedback. This specifically is coming from the online survey, where we ask people what kind of actions they'd like to see, and you can write whatever you want, and we can kind of pick out keywords that pop up in those responses. And so that's what this this image on the right of your screen, a word cloud. The size of the word correlates to how many times that word came up in those comments. So we see that there's a lot of concern about trees and power and wind and storms, which really ties back to the power grid resiliency action that we saw on the previous slide. And also we see dam on here, coordination. And so we can see, kind of looking at this, what kinds of key issues there are for people. And again, which this kind of repeating a little bit what already came up, identification of risk areas was important, protecting power lines from trees and wind, focusing on emergency response, and as well as floodplain management training for municipal staff. These are some of the key actions that we saw. So these all feed into the mitigation actions. There were 3 different sources broadly for where these actions came from. There were the actions that came out of the public input, as we just reviewed, actions that came up during meetings with municipal staff that took place in the summer of 2020. And that's a combination of looking at previous plans and seeing what actions were in those, and which might want to be carried forward or revised but carried forward in the new document, as well as new actions based on the opinions of municipal staff. And then we also included a series of actions that came from state and regional initiatives. And we'll go through some of those in the next slides. So there's a lot of towns, a lot of municipalities, and a lot of actions in this document. So there are some patterns, again, to what actions come up. So this is a summary of the top actions, the most frequently included actions in the different municipal documents, the different municipal annexes of the overall plan. So there are a lot of actions dealing with drainage structure improvements. So that's things like improved drainage on specific roads in various communities, upgrading culverts and things like that. Actually, that comes up later. So drainage from roads would be the drainage one. Dam safety, making sure that dams are up to code, or being reviewed regularly and are safe. Critical facility protection. So those are any actions that address specific critical facilities and making sure that they're protected from various hazards. So things like fire stations, town and city halls, emergency operations centers, and so on. Backup power for critical facilities specifically, especially for shelters, was a common action. So making sure that there are emergency generators available for shelters, for example. Culvert and bridge upgrades, making sure that they're large enough to pass flood events, including the debris that might come along with the flood event. Evacuation and access, making sure that people are able to evacuate from their homes, or that their homes can be accessed by emergency responders. That can be following a flood if roads are washed out or flooded, or if there is a storm that knocks down trees and debris into a road and blocking them. So various actions to address those risks in order to maintain access. There were a number of actions that fell into the category of administration, enforcement, and maintenance. That could be hiring specific employees for towns to make sure that they improve their administrative capabilities to, say, apply for grant funding to implement hazard mitigation actions, enforcing rules that are already on the books, but so there's already a regulation against certain actions to protect people, but we want to make sure that they're actually enforced. So those types of actions. Next on the list, conducting studies to understand where risks are and what kind of risks are faced by the communities. There were a number of actions looking at wildfire risk reduction, which might include expanding water access in remote areas to make sure that if there is a fire in a remote area, the fire departments are able to access water to put those out. excuse me. Acquisition and open space, that can kind of mitigate hazards in two different ways. One is that acquiring open space can, if that open space is in a flood zone, can actually allow that area to flood safely and protect areas upstream or downstream from flooding by kind of slowing down the water and giving it space. It can also mitigate hazards by just preventing development in an area that is at risk. So if you don't develop in an area that's at risk from landslides, then you don't have to worry about landslides happening in that area. So acquisition and open space is a great action. Some actions about landslide mitigation, and then public education and engagement, and then a number of actions for emergency response, alerts, and communication. So those might be upgrading firefighting equipment, upgrading emergency alerts and radio communication, a variety of things like that. So these are some of the top actions that we saw throughout the region. These top actions don't include the regional and state initiatives, which also count as top actions because they were included in every municipality. So this is the list of what those regional and state initiatives are. So FEMA map updates, all communities in the Farmington River watershed and the Housatonic River watershed. FEMA is updating those flood maps. And so we included an action to make sure that communities are staying on top of that and coordinating with those updates. Historic resource, this is a statewide effort to look at historic resources and their vulnerability to flooding. So actions included in plans include surveying historic resources in risk zones, particularly flood zones, so that communities know what historic resources are at risk, and then conducting outreach to owners of those resources about various ways that they can protect those resources from flooding while still maintaining their historic character. Actions to make sure that lists of repetitive loss properties are up to date and contacting owners of repetitive loss properties. Repetitive loss properties are properties that have experienced multiple flood damages over a 10-year period. Updating regulations and building codes at the local level to make sure that they match state building codes and state flood regulation guidelines. Looking at small businesses that use hazardous chemicals that might be located in flood zones because of the risk of spills during a flood that can really exacerbate the damages from that flood. Cooperating with the Sustainable Connecticut statewide effort to make communities more sustainable, which some of those actions tie into hazard mitigation, not all of them, but some of them. And so registering with that program and taking actions through that program. Similarly, with the Resilient Connecticut program, participating in efforts to make the state resilient. And there are a few actions related to that are being pushed at the state level, particularly around development around transit hubs. And then looking at low impact development, in particular using a rural communities low impact development handbook that was developed for Morris, but applies statewide. So that is a quick and potentially thorough summary of all of the different actions. There are hundreds of them, so we're trying to really give just a taste of what types of actions were included in the documents. And we can go into a little bit more detail later if people are interested, but we'll for now move on to the next steps in the planning process. So we have developed the draft plans, and those have been out for review from the municipalities. We've received feedback and updated those documents accordingly. The updated draft for public review is going to be posted tomorrow, August 5th, online on the NVCOG website. We encourage you to review the documents, in particular your community's annex, if that's more manageable for you than the entire multi-jurisdictional document. And we really encourage you to share this with your communities, your neighbors, your friends, to have them look at it as well. And see, give us feedback, review the document, and give any feedback that you might have. particularly focus on the mitigation actions. The actions that are listed in the document really can drive municipal actions moving forward, and also create opportunity for funding for those actions from the federal government. So check out the list of mitigation actions for your community and share your thoughts with me, Noah Slovin. My website is, my email is up here, nslovin@slrconsulting.com. Once we receive feedback from the public, we'll at the same time, actually, I believe we'll be having the state review it. So having both of those happen kind of in parallel. And then once we get feedback from the public and or from the states, we'll then send an updated draft to FEMA, hopefully in late August, for FEMA to review. Once FEMA reviews, they kind of give us approval, and then the municipalities can adopt that approved document. And then the document will be valid for 5 years, and then you get to update it again. So that's what I have. Dave, any comments?
No, I think at this point we can turn it over to discussion, and we have a couple participants from what I think the Waterbury and Bristol they're representing. So one thing that we can do is, if there's interest, we can kind of shut down the PowerPoint and then share those annexes, and we can kind of go through the actions for those two towns. But we don't have to do that, so we're open to suggestions.
So I think what I'll do, if it works for everyone, unless maybe Aaron, you disagree, I was going to stop recording. So we have a recording of the presentation that we can share, but